Oh, cool. Hangout is live. And you get to look at the infinite screen, go on and on and on. Excellent. Okay, so hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm back, and this is a stream I've wanted to do for a bit. Balls.
Excellent.
Okay.
So, hello, ladies and gentlemen.
Which window is that?
I'm back, and this is a stream.
Okay, there we go. Echo. I'm also using my laptop mic, so that's why that. And I'll also try to monitor chat through this. Prag, you're a liberal yourself. Oh, boomer tech. Yes, boomer tech. No, I am not a liberal. Liberal. I am not a liberal. Is this the PragerU? Yes, this is the PragerU. But no, I am not a liberal. Shut your dirty lying mouth. Yeah, no, I'm dumb and don't know how to use OBS, so yeah, that's that. But I'll do my best to monitor shit in my boomer fashion as I do. All right, so that's the whole of chat. Okay, Hegel, my guy, pretty much. Essentially, that is. You know what? Let me make sure. I'll make this live, but turn off the shit. Shut the fuck up, Elmo. I'm not. At least I'm not muted for the first 20 minutes of the stream, and I have volume and I have chat on, so people can tell me when I'm being a boomer. And I don't think this counts as being a boomer. I just think I'm technologically illiterate, which is a fair criticism. But anyway, Hegel, my guy. He's one of the two dudes doing the little fusion dance in my icon. The other guy is Pope Pius XII, who did the papal encyclical against communism. So yeah, there's the story of that. That's why I like those two guys. And the Piuses were like Pius 9 through 12 were all 19th and 20th century popes, and they all did a pretty good job. So that's why I like him. But Hegel, why do I like Hegel? Because I think the dialectical method he's created is correct largely, and I think when applied to the historical front brings up a lot of truths. And I think, you can kind of try to limit that to the simple thesis antithesis way of looking at it, but I think that's a little bit too narrow, and that you can expand it to an ever increasing, possibly infinite number of theses and antitheses until you get the big dialectical shift. If that's your sort of thing, you can talk about it in big moments in history and things like that. It works with a lot of different theories of history, and that's one of the big themes of this video, if you will. Elmo, you can't talk. You're a prot. You're a heretic, man. And I don't like you. No, I'm kidding. You're all right. You're an okay heretic. But no, Hegel was a prot, which is also a problem. But I do think his philosophy has a lot to offer. Am I going to boomer this up? Let me just close Discord. There we go. The notifications will still pop up, but whatever. Speaking of the devil. But anyway. What was I saying? Oh, yeah, his history. The dialectical method, I think, works with a lot of different popular theories of history right now, be they great man theory, everyman theory, cyclical, linear. Of course, obviously, the Marxist theory borrows heavily from Hegel, even some of the geographic theory. And even, you sort of have two other theories which aren't really in the mainstream academia, but are worth mentioning because they've somewhat informed my thought recently are, the genetic thought of history, which is that, culture and stuff is all downstream from genes. And so history is determined by the people, and the people are made of genes. So history is determined by genes. I don't buy into it fully because I'm not a dirty materialist. And so there's that. And there's also sort of the more, what I used to believe in a while ago was like the libertarian theory of history, which is kind of put forth by Murray Rothbard, and is sort of like the struggle of freedom versus authority. And it's like the ultimate freedom of people is like what's been struggling against, and we were more free in some periods, we weren't in others. It's back and forth. There's no particular direction to that theory, which I guess makes it somewhat interesting and possibly could lend more validity to it. But, it's not really anything in particular, because what is freedom? What is it? Positive? Is it negative? Is it only negative? Freedom for whom? Freedom from what? The debate rages onwards and so forth and so on. But yeah, and that's who we're going to be dealing with somewhat today. The first guy happens to be Murray Rothbard. What a coincidence. Not really, though. And so he's here to talk about Romanticism and Hegel's role in it, and how it's been like a bane on freedom-loving people for all this time and all that stuff. So yeah, you're going to have to stomach some Rothbard. But that's okay, because we'll get through it together. Anyway, so we jumping into it. G.W. Hegel, unfortunately, was not a bizarre, aberrant force in European thought. He was only one, if the most influential and the most convoluted and hypertrophic of what must be considered the dominant paradigm of his age, the celebrated age of Romanticism. Full points to Murray Rothbard for convoluted and hypertrophic. Was not a good writer, but most Germans weren't, or at least they don't translate well into English, so credit where it's due. I think other romantics do it a lot better. I think Goethe and Wagner and Schelling do it a bit better, or Schiller, I should say, not Schelling. There is a difference, even though all the names sound the same. But yeah, I think Romanticism as a movement wasn't convoluted, but Hegel sure as hell was. So moving on. In different variants and in different ways, the Romantic writers of the first half of the 19th century, especially in Germany and Great Britain, poets and novelists as well as philosophers, were dominated by a similar creatology and eschatology. It might be termed the alienation and return or reabsorption myth. He missed a good turn. He missed a good term here, Rothbard. Alienation and return is fairly correct, because that's the dialectical method, essentially. But reabsorption is wrong. A better word would have been sublimation, because that's the wording Hegel uses himself. And there's a lot of debate over the meaning of that specific word and how it applies to the dialectic process, and what is sublimated, what parts are left behind, what becomes integrated into the synthesis. Is that really what sublimation means? All sorts of good stuff. But maybe I should shill this stream in Twitter chats. Probably not. This will be a small, irrelevant stream because nobody loves Hegel, which is unfortunate. But moving on. Now, let me make sure I'm still live, still functioning properly. Okay, all good. All right. God created the universe out of imperfection and felt need, thereby tragically cutting man, the organic species, off from his pre-creation unity with God. That's a weird way to talk about the fall. Just a heads up, this is the first time I'm reading it, and I didn't want to spoil it for the stream. But that's a weird way to talk about the fall, and certainly not how I'd say the Romantics talk about it, at least not Hegel. Well, this transcendence, this Aufbung of creation has permitted God and man, or God-man, to develop their faculties and to progress. Tragic alienation will continue until that day, inevitable and determined, in which God and man will be focused into the cosmic blob. That's kind of a dumb way to put it. It's a dumb way to put the dialectical process, and the idea that the dialectical process is used to bring us all closer to the absolute, because we're just experiencing things, we're not really here. So I think Rothbard's being a little purposefully obtuse here. Here we go. I'll keep reading, and I'll keep monitoring chat and all that, but whatchamacallit, just keep, all right, stuff is handled. All right, so where did I leave off? Private chats and whatnot, folks. Why can't I find where I left off? Okay, or rather being pantheists, as was Hegel. Again, a dubious claim, because kind of not really, but, you know, it is there. Until man discovers that he is man, God and the alienation of man from nature, and man from God will be ended, as all is fused into the one big blob, the discovery of the reality of, and therefore the merger into cosmic oneness. He capitalizes oneness there, which I suppose is correct, because it is indeed, whatchamacallit, correct. It's called the absolute, though, and I think, again, I think he's being somewhat purposefully obtuse. But, to continue. History, which has been predetermined toward this goal, will then come to an end in the romantic metaphor. Man, the generic organism, of course, not the individual, will at least return home. History is therefore an upward spiral towards man-determined destination and return home, but on a far higher level than the original unity or home with God in the pre-creation epoch. That's somewhat true, in the sense that that's the point of the alienation. You get separated from oneness to come back to it, and with a fuller understanding of being the oneness yourself. It's very similar to Buddhism in that, you're kind of just there. You're not really this clump of cells experiencing things. You're something more than it. So, not entirely inaccurate. Although I don't know if idealism in some form or another was the dominant ideology of at least German Romanticism, but I think it's not entirely accurate to formulate all of Romanticism that way. The domination of Romantic writers by this paradigm has been expounded brilliantly by the leading literary critic of Romanticism, M.H. Abrams, who points to this leading strain in English literature stretching from Wordsworth to D.H. Lawrence. Wordsworth, Abrams emphasizes, dedicated virtually his entire output to a heroic or high romantic argument, to an attempt to counter the to an attempt to counter and transcend Milton's epochal poem of an orthodox Christian view of man and God. So, to counter Paradise Lost and to counter the somewhat fallen man view, which I don't think is accurate because, again, the fall is a part of idealism as well, just in a different sense. I think Rothbard's mixing metaphors here, but not entirely inaccurate, perhaps. Let's see. Do I want to share screen again? Yeah, I think I can. Share, yep. Hide. All right, all is well in the world. America First calling. Oh boy, I'm competing with America First. That's not good. But anyway, to counter Milton's Christian, to counter Milton's Christian view of heaven, I got to stop doing that. Real boomer hours, who up? To counter Milton's Christian view of heaven and hell as alternatives for individual souls, and of Jesus' second advent as putting an end to history and returning man to paradise, Wordsworth, in his own argument, counterpoises his pantheist vision of the upward spiral of history into cosmic unification and man's consequent return home from alienation. I don't know Wordsworth, so maybe he was a pantheist, but Hegel wasn't. At least the consensus, I think, amongst Hegel scholars is that he isn't. And there's a citation, so why don't we just scroll down? It's just... okay. Nothing highly important. The eventual eschaton, the kingdom of God, is taken from its Christian placement in heaven and brought down to earth. Thereby, as always, when the eschaton is immanentized, creating spectacularly grave ideological, social, and political problems. Or, to use a concept of Abrams, the romantic vision constituted the secularization of theology. Yes and no. It was its own sort of religious vision. It was its own religion, or at least religious outlook, because that's what pantheism is. And at the same time, some of it tried to be secular. Later attempts would make it secular, but it wasn't inherently secular. And oneness was sort of considered to be a religious thing. So, I don't know. This seems to be a lot of fancy misdirection by Rothbard here. I'm not digging it. I had higher hopes originally. Greek and Roman epics, Wordsworth asserted, sang of arms and the man, hitherto the only argument heroic deemed. Capital A. In contrast, at the beginning of his great Paradise Lost, Milton declares that to the height of this great argument I may assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to man. That is indeed Milton. I don't know if Rothbard's setting these up as if they're mutually exclusive. You can have, or one is secular and the other is anti-religious. Again, the idea of man transcending what appears to be physical to become one with the universe is a deep cosmological outlook. And so pertained to a lot of different methods. It's, again, is Buddhism a religion? Is it just a philosophy? There's a debate about that. It's certainly not secular, I would say. But I could talk to, who's it? I could talk to Ghost of Watts about that. Wordsworth now proclaimed that his own argument, surpassing Milton's, was instilled in him by God's holy powers and faculties, enabling him, presaging Marx's yearnings, to create his own world, even though he realized in an unwanted flash of realism that some called it madness. The way I was going to save this till later, but I guess I can bring it up now. The way Marxists viewed idealism as a method and the dialectic as a method is far different than how the Husama called it. The idealist proper realized it. I'm trying to find. Yes. I'm trying to find it something. It's actually in Critical Theory, Selected Essays by Max Horkheimer. A good book if you want to understand the modern left. I'm only not even a tenth or so of the way in, but it's a lot of good information. Unfortunately, I don't bookmark it all. Gosh darn it, where is it? All right, I'll boil it down. You can go check it. It's in the essay, Materialism and Metaphysics. Essentially, what it says is that the Marxists and the materialists viewed idealism as a method, which is the same way they actually view materialism. So they don't really have a method, according to Horkheimer, but he's a certain kind of Marxist. So that might not be the most accurate take, But it seems to be true, because what Marx does is really, speaking of Ghost of Watts, how prescient. What Marx does is take the dialectical method of Hegel and he gives it a completely new metaphysics, so to speak. He makes it, Zizek's argument for this has always been that Hegel didn't go far enough with the dialectic in terms of viewing the system of capitalism, and so Hegel didn't realize his own materialism, which is sort of what Hegel did to Kant when Kant tried to say, we can never know the true reality because our reason is imperfect. Hegel said, no, screw you. Our reason is just as much a part of reality as anything else. And so it's just as much, we're just as much capable of understanding the whole universe as we are understanding the thing in itself, because we are no less part of the whole universe than the thing in itself. Which is a really long way to say, essentially, just, oh God, stop it. Which is just a really long way to say a lot of dumb stuff. No, not entirely. Like, it's interesting what Zizek tries to do and what Marx tries to do by saying, hey, here's, this kind of metaphysical system that Hegel had, and here's the system he used to justify it. We're going to take it another step further, according to us, and say it actually justifies this other system. But Kant and Hegel were both idealists, and Hegel just created a more refined system of absolutism or of idealism, I should say, than did Kant. And so when you flip metaphysics, it doesn't work as well. But yeah, go watch Zizek. I like to recommend him because I think he's a good speaker. Well, he's not a good speaker. He's like Hegel. He's very convoluted, and I think it's fair to say and all that. But I think it's fair enough to say that he explains a lot of things about Hegel and Marx correctly. And if you know, if you know Hegel, you can know most of the left. It's not hard. It's all just bad forms of Hegel, including postmodernism, by the way. I just listened to a lecture with Zizek that talked about the difference between Jacques Derrida's concept of deconstruction and Hegel's concept of sublimation. Or that wasn't the topic of it, but that was a portion of it. I think the title of the lecture on YouTube is Hegel in Athens. You can probably find it like that. But anyway, enough ramblings, because I do want to get to a video before I have to go do something like make sure my dog doesn't pee on the carpet. All right. So where were we? Oh, yes, right around here. And I keep doing the thing. All right. For there passed within him genius, power, creation, and divinity itself. Wordsworth concluded that this is in truth heroic argument, an argument not less but more heroic than the wrath of stern Achilles. Other Englishmen steeped in the Wordsworthian paradigm were his worshipful follower Coleridge, Shelley, Keats, and Blake, who, however, tried to blend Christianity and pantheism. I think he's trying to call reflection on nature and aesthetics pantheism. I think that's Rothbard's problem here, and I think that's dumb, because you can have an aesthetic appreciation of things and have that inform your belief of what's true without accepting that, idealism as a whole. So I don't know. It's a dumb misconception. But shall we continue? Yeah, no. Balls. This is I'm gonna subtitle this real boomer hours, I swear to God. Continuing. All these writers had been steeped in Christian doctrine from which they could spin off their own heretical pantheist version of millennialism. That's kind of rich coming from Rothbard, who was raised Jewish and then, to the best of my knowledge, was an atheist. So I don't know what authority he's speaking on and what experience he has with it. But to continue, Wordsworth himself had been trained to become an Anglican priest. Coleridge was a philosopher and a lay preacher who had been on the edge of becoming a Unitarian minister and was steeped in Neoplatonism and the works of Jacob Boehme. Keats was an explicit disciple of the Wordsworthian program, which he called a means towards secular salvation. And Shelley, though an explicit atheist, idolized the sacred Milton above all other poets and was constantly steeped in study of the Bible. So Shelley, I suppose, was a pre-Jordan Peterson, I guess. But yeah, well, Neoplatonism is the only thing troubling me here, because it's the only thing that you could relatively tie into a sort of Gnostic, possibly idealist interpretation of things. But at the same time, Thomas Aquinas used Neoplatonism in a lot of his work. So, and in what context Rothbard means this it's impossible to tell. So Rothbard's mushing together a lot of words and concepts that I don't think belong together, and it's annoying me. But then again, he was a better economist than he was a philosopher. People don't know, but he graduated from Columbia, and in my uni's library, I actually found, I think what was not maybe his thesis work, but certainly something, it was from Columbia, so it was something he worked on while in Columbia. And it fascinated me because it read far more anti-free market than any of his later works, which is sort of a pattern in academia. You can't really be published in any proper paper with a really radical libertarian type of view unless you're a sort of Hayekian like Peter Klein, who kind of curtails it with a lot of modern monetary theory caveats and stuff like that, but I digress. It should also be noted that Wordsworth, like Hegel, was a youthful enthusiast for the French Revolution and its liberal ideals, and later, delusioned, turned to conservative statism and the pantheist version of the inevitable redemption through history. He was disillusioned, but he didn't turn to conservatism, I would say. There was a certain conservative streak to him in the institutions he ended up supporting, but he himself wasn't a conservative. This is also something Zizek likes to make the point against. But, you know, you need cultural context. You couldn't really be a state philosopher like Hegel kind of was and not support the status quo, which happened to be conservative. I'm going to get into it a bit. I got a book here by Peter Singer. It's a very short it's Hegel, A Very Short Introduction, which is a great introduction to Hegel. A lot of good suggested lit. And I'm going to get into why, you know, stuff isn't as clear cut as people would like to be who claim Hegel was a conservative or Hegel was a reactionary. Yada, yada, yada. But anyway, continuing on. The German Romantics were even more immersed in religion and mysticism than were their English counterparts. Hegel, Friedrich von Schelling, Friedrich von Schiller, Friedrich Hölderlin, Johann Gottlieb Fichte were all theology students, most of them with Hegel at the University of Tübingen. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right at all, but that's true. They all studied to be Lutheran ministers at some point. Hegel and Schelling were directly friends. Schelling studied under Fichte. Schiller was a big influence on Hegel, and I think they communicated a few times through letters. Hölderlin and Hegel and Schelling all knew each other directly as well. So yeah, there's a lot of interplay between the big German Romantics because they all knew each other pretty much personally, with the exception of, I think, Hegel and Fichte, who didn't really interact much personally, except through Schelling as an intermediary. All of them tried explicitly to apply religious doctrine to their philosophy. Novalis was immersed in the Bible. Furthermore, Hegel devoted a great deal of favorable attention to Boehme. in his lectures on the history of philosophy, and Schelling called Bohm a miraculous phenomenon in the history of mankind. Yeah, this is a stupid misreading of Hegel right here, because if you know anything about Hegel, it's that really he was very anti-Christian in his early years. He was studying to be a Lutheran minister at the same time, but he did not hold a high opinion of Jesus Christ. He did a little work comparing Jesus Christ to Socrates, and he eventually came to the conclusion Socrates was a better moral teacher than Jesus. Yeah, not very favorable. No, whatever. Not very favorable at all. He was also not big into this idea that, Jesus was not simply not a great moral teacher, but not even a great man necessarily. He was much more into Jesus as a political figure. Something else Hegel, a very short introduction, talks about. But if you really want to get into the history of Hegel, I'd also recommend Walter Kaufmann's Hegel text reinterpretations and commentary and things of that nature. That is a good convo right there. Anyway, it should also be noted Wordsworth, like, hey, wait, no. Here we go. Okay. The German Romantics were even more immersed in religion. And, whoops, I read that. Essentially called us. Yeah, I don't know who Bohm is. In the 3 books I've read on Hegel, his life, and the things that have influenced him directly, I might have come across him once or twice, but I only think as like a mention of another romantic who might have influenced him. Maybe he influenced Schelling more than anything else. I haven't read his lectures on the history of philosophy, but of course, history of philosophy isn't really a central work if you want to study Hegel. It's more the philosophy of history is the big one, which of course Marx draws from. There's also, I think, a pretty clear influence in Spengler, like I mentioned in the description of this. So, yeah. Moreover, it was Friedrich Schiller, Hegel's mentor. I'm getting hung up on a myriad of tiny details, but mentor is a strong word for their relationship, and I don't know if it fits if you read the historical context. I'm sorry, I'm being really picky about Hegel's biography, but it was influenced by Scott Adam Ferguson to denounce specialization in the division of labor as alienating and fragmenting man, and it was Schiller who influenced Hegel in the 1790s, coining the explicit concept of Aufbauung and the dialectic. That later part is somewhat true, because if you go to the Kaufmann book that I recommended, you actually see, people like to go on about the Kantian influence in Hegel, because it goes Kant to fit to Hegel, essentially, is the line of direct historical inheritance, pretty much in German idealism. But you actually find a lot more pre-Hegelian notions in Schiller, than you do in Kant. And if anything, you could make the case that Kant is unnecessary for the formation of Hegel, and that Hegel could have just read Schiller and would still largely have come up with the same philosophy. If anything, it would have been a little bit more clearly written, because Kant's work is almost as a convoluted mess. It's written a little bit more clearly because it's been given more attention. But it was Kant's style of heavy academic writing that sort of made Hegel think he needed to also write in this overbearing sort of intellectual tone. So, if you kill Kant, you can still get Hegel, and possibly a Hegel who's far more free with his writing and far more clear. But to go to the first part of that sentence, Scott Adam Ferguson, who denounced specialization in the division of labor, Hegel talked about alienation in the history of philosophy as a process that would occur in everything, but that needed to occur. And we have a negative connotation of alienation today because the Marxists have kind of picked it up and essentially told us that, worker alienation is bad, it needs to be fixed, yada, yada, yada. But it really wouldn't do much necessarily, because Hegel was a big believer in this idea that the dialectic would kind of just happen naturally, not so much that it would just, not so much that it would be forced by certain great men per se. Certain great men might champion the dialectic and might end up being the catalyst or the people who lead us to synthesis, but they wouldn't force the moment. They'd kind of just take up the opportunity. Like, that's Zizek's big view on Lenin. Lenin didn't force the dialectic. He was just there as it was happening, and he ended up championing the shift. So, very, very odd kind of phrasing here. And so, again, alienation didn't have a negative connotation for Hegel. It just had to happen. Something else to note, Hegel does talk about the alienation of worker and master to some extent, not just slave master, but, worker and capitalist, if you want to put it like that. And what's important to note is that the alienation, he says, is almost equal or greater than the alienation of the master is almost equal or greater than the alienation of the slave or the worker, because what the slave gets to do or the worker gets to do is craft with his hands and mold the surrounding environment, and through his interaction with other things and the rest of reality gets a better grip on himself through these relations which he experiences. He is simultaneously alienating himself from nature to some extent, but also then sublimating himself back into it. And so you get a far richer, fuller personal experience out of work than you do with being the master. So it was almost a worse condition to be a landowner or a factory owner in Hegel's eyes than to be a working person, because the working person had a fuller life. Now, there's also the idea of, surplus value and people working and selling their product out of necessity and things like that. And so that selling of the object is another form of alienation, but that's another conversation for a more Marxist bent. The point is, Hegel didn't view alienation in a negative way. And to make it as though he was anti-specialization or anti-capitalist is sort of giving too much credit to the Marxists. Next paragraph, right around here. You see it. I'm not going to click on it because I know what's going to happen. But in England, several decades later, the tempestuous and conservative statist writer Thomas Carlyle paid tribute to Friedrich Schiller by writing a biography of the Romantic writer in 1825. From then on, Carlyle's writings were permeated with the Hegelian vision. Okay, I don't know who this person is, but maybe that's true. Unity is good, the diversity or separateness is evil and disease. Hegel didn't believe that. He believed that the eventual arrival at unity was good, but that, diversity at some point was needed. It wasn't to be shunned or rejected. It was just a phase along the way. It's not that it's not even good or bad. It's good because it needs to happen. Hegel is someone who believes like the fall of mankind was necessary to happen. Good book to read on that topic is G.W. Hegel, and by, I believe it's Clark Butler. And it does a very good job of relating the historical thought of Hegel into a much more reliable fashion and how he thought of the dialectic. Unity, selfhood, Carlyle ranted his alienation from nature, from others, and from oneself. But one day there will come the breakthrough, the spiritual rebirth, led by world historical figures, great men. Man will return home to a friendly world by means of the utter cancellation, the annihilation of the self. Yeah, that's the in which Rothbard is attributing these things to Hegel is dumb. It's not accurate, to be more precise. It is not what Hegel wrote about. These were things that were going to happen, because again, he is a historicist. These things just have to happen. There's a good moral connotation happening to it because it needs to happen. So this is a lot of hooey. Finally, in past and present, Carlyle applied his profoundly anti-individualist. It's not anti-individualist, it's just anti-atomization is a better way to put it. And one might add anti-human vision to economic affairs. He denounced egoism, material greed, and laissez-faire, which, by fostering the severance of man from each other, had led the world, which has become lifeless, other, and in severance also from the human beings with a social order in which cash payment is the sole nexus of man with man. Damn. Sounds like Carlyle was sort of a pre-Marxist or almost more influenced. I don't know the historical dates of Marx and Engels' writings, so maybe he was influenced more by Marx than Hegel, and that's what's happening here. And Marx and Rothbard's trying to cut out the middleman and throw it all on Hegel's feet. But I don't know. I don't know when a lot of Marx's texts were published. But this seems more Marxist in tone than Hegelian. So maybe Carlyle was a pre-Marxist, or maybe he was influenced by Marx and Rothbard's just throwing it at Hegel. Either way, a lot of this stuff is like taking liberty. This Carlyle guy seems to be taking liberties with Hegel, and then Rothbard seems to be taking even more liberties. In opposition to this metaphysically evil cash nexus lay the familial relation with nature and fellow men, the relation of love. The stage was set for Karl Marx. What a fucking... what a setup, right? It's like, hey, communion with nature and fellow man through familial relations and bonds. Here comes materialism and the brutal glorification of the individual, just not in the way you think about it, Murray Rothbard. That's such an absolute logical leap from, like, with nature and fellow man, the relation of love. That could easily be described as the whatchamacallit, the very Hegelian rational society, which is what Hegel strives for. But that's to say you can get from the rational society to communist utopia is a massive leap, because you have to jump from metaphysics. You have to jump from one metaphysic to the complete opposite one. And then you also have to ignore a lot of what Hegel says about how the rational society comes about, because a lot of Marxist instigation of revolution is very anti-Hegelian. Again, Lenin was a good Hegelian in some sense because he didn't force revolution. Revolution was there, and the Bolsheviks took it. Something to note in a historical context, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm quoting this from like 10th grade history class, so maybe my memory's off. But, you know, at some annual meeting of communists, there were the Bolsheviks, and then there were the Mensheviks, and there were a couple other parties, all sort of vying for what the future of Russia would be during World War I and things like that. And I believe what was going on was, like, the Mensheviks were the majority party and the Bolsheviks were the minority party, because I think men is like Menshe or something is like majority, and Bull was like the minority, something like that. But the Mensheviks, because they didn't believe the meeting or whatever was going anywhere, ended up walking out. And so the Bolsheviks kind of took the stage and got the revolution going to some extent. And Lenin stepped in, of course. But, like, that's the thing. That was the stage. That was the moment of the dialectical shift. And Lenin was just there at the right time to take advantage of it. He didn't force it to happen. Everything in history was leading up to that moment, essentially. Or there was a clear chain of causality that was leading up to that. And Lenin was there to take the ropes. But, yeah, this is a lot of wrong, not accurate to Hegel, not accurate to the Romantic movement at all. And so that's Rothbard. Now, the next part, we started at 7:40, so I suppose I've been going for near 50 minutes now. that's not too bad. But this next part's going to be a doozy because I'm going to go over whatchamacallit, this Crown T video. Important thing to note right here, because a lot of people like to be real anal about sources and whatnot. You've been following me on Twitter, you might know who I'm talking about, but no sources here on what he's about to say or on what he's referencing, except the reference in video of a few books. But by the academic standards of some, that would certainly fail as proper listing of citation of sources and whatnot. So we're going to review Kraut's little screed. If you go to his channel, and I'll just go to his channel quickly and whatnot. If you go to whatchamacallit, if you go to his homepage right here, wow, 1,000, only 1,100 away from, or 1,200 away from being below 100K. Interesting. I'll never take him. I'll never miss a moment to shit on him. But the little thumbnail for this video is Hegel, or this is the top of Hegel's head. If you Google Hegel, you'll probably see this picture of an old, decrepit Hegel. Not really the younger Hegel will be probably in the first line too, but this is the most common picture right here. And so, anyway, oh, that's rich. And his related channels is Black Pigeon Speaks. That's funny. But anyway, let's get into Kraut's screed about Hegel and historicism, which is unresearched garbage.
I've never said someone else will figure it out. What I've always said is that history will show us the way. There are going to be contingencies to the historical experience that we cannot predict. I think it would be bizarre and ridiculous for me to sit down and say, well, tomorrow morning, in order to implement the ethno-state, we're going to do this, and then we'll do this, and then we'll do that. History doesn't work like that. History will offer opportunities for dramatic, paradigmatic change.
Okay, so that's a very Hegelian point, admittedly, by our friend Dickie Spencer right here. Begrudgingly, I admit that. How's the volume coming through? Maybe I'll just give the stream a listen to here for a second. Okay, so the volume's coming through. Good. When I'm less of a technological illiterate and learn how to, whatchamacallit, use OBS, I will perhaps do that someday. But anyway, for now, we continue onward with Kraut's screed.
How do you view history? Do you see it as a gradual progression of society, its norms, technology, views, standards, and beliefs? Do you see history as the evolution of society, or possibly even mankind? That history represents a sequence of events, possibly on the gradient or cyclical, that therefore provides a foundation from which one is able to, through sociological methods, predict future events and deduct shifts within society's future?
I'm going to pause a little bit later on. I'll skip around. I won't go through the whole thing, but it will end up being longer because I'm going through most of it. Sociology, psychology, economics, just to name the obvious ones, are all sort of sciences based on this idea that based on past events, we can induct future ones. Like there's a chain of causality that exists. We're not being sort of dumb Humeans here, or we're not being complete Humeans here in the sense that causality is a completely unbroken chain and we're determinists to some extent, but we're also not Whitehedians in that the moments that came before and led up to this have no correlation to what's happening now. Induction is a thing that exists for a reason, and it's plausible, and it's why we have science in the first place. If you don't have induction, you got a lot of problems with the scientific method. But to continue.
Does history reflect a political evolution? Does it move as an arch towards progression and betterment? Does it move in waves? Are we able to, for the study of history, establish a social science and political methods to solving and explaining our current problems by letting history show us the way?
Yes and no. Again, these are... Kraut's going to kind of conflate a couple things here, like Hegel's philosophical concept of history as a transcendent force that moves us forward, and using empirical methods to try to tell the future, quote unquote, or to some extent. And again, like I said, we have empirical measures that we can base things on. Is economics a reliable science? Depends on who you listen to, I suppose, but it's been doing pretty good in my eyes at predicting what gets the economy going, what doesn't. Psychology a reliable science? I don't know. How many millions of possible people have it helped? You can be as anal about it as you want, but the point is there are measures that we can take to help mitigate future events. We can draw historical parallels, or we can do science, which is learning from things that happened in the past to some extent, taking observations from the past and believing they are repeatable and have not only descriptive validity, but predictive validity as well. So this is an odd point in my mind. Also, I'm looking over at notes here, and I'm trying to think of what I was saying when I first watched this. This is, of course, an incredibly empirical way of looking at history, what Kraut's describing right now. As I mentioned earlier, which I didn't think I would, but according to Horkheimer in his essay, Materialism and Metaphysics, what you have is materialism as a method and idealism as just methods. And you need broader context for certain things. They're just methods of discerning what's now. And, it's all, if you're going to say idealism and the historical push and the dialectic towards an absolute is wrong, and it's wrong to use it, you're not going to be able to debunk it using an empirical case against it. It needs to be from a philosophical standpoint. Unless you are just saying, this is all just materialism, the idealists are being fake, and in which case you'd be adopting a particularly Marxist method, which I'm not sure Kraut would be in favor of, or if he'd be opposed of. I'd very much wonder what he'd think about Horkheimer's essay here. But to continue.
If so, you may be unaware that there is a name for this belief, which is historicism. It's admittedly an inviting idea that feels almost like intuition and shapes an easy framework from which one may view history and, by extent, society itself. Events which we view from such a lens may be interpreted as the progression of society, from a starting point to an outcome. Event B is the result of event A, and its struggles are continued in the current event C.
Yes. Again, causality is a thing, is the simplest way to put it. We can draw lines of causality saying, if this thing hadn't happened, this other thing wouldn't have either. And that's true. If we had not abolished slavery, if we had slavery today, we would not be dealing with Black Lives Matter. That's not, obviously, I don't think slavery outweighs, or obviously I don't think Black Lives Matter is negative enough to outweigh the net good of abolishing slavery, obviously. But, again, there's a causal link between these things. And I think it's weird to say there's not. Or at least to make the case that you can't use historical causality to draw inferences into the future. Again, that's what you do with science. Or at least the social sciences, and in some case the hard sciences too. We're all building on the idea that, the apple fell from Newton's tree yesterday, and so it will continue to do. The sun rose today, it will continue to do so tomorrow. That's induction. That's the scientific method. But to continue.
You may also see it as the process of repetition and the cycle. The current event D is a repetition of the event E, and certain historical events appear suddenly as mechanisms of history, suddenly seeming to make sense as notions of there being a historic destiny, start to creep in. It provides a meaning to history, a sense of purpose, that there might even be a goal to strive towards for society.
Again, like, he's laying it out now because I think he's somewhat trying to steelman it, but it's all with sort of the connotation, like if you were watching the graphics, that this isn't something you're supposed to believe in. Like, you can kind of get that connotation from the beginning of the video. And it's weird. Can we not draw parallels from past events to present ones and try to better handle the present events so that the future turns out better? Like, are there no similarities between historical events at all? It seems, and I'm not saying that's exactly what he said. Obviously, he's not saying you can't draw lessons from history, but he seems to be implying that to do so and to try to draw meaning from these things and to try to apply that going forward is weird, or that it's something that shouldn't be taken as seriously as people want to. And we'll get to that later on. I'll be skipping around a little bit after this.
But is it though? How was history viewed and written throughout the ages? The father of history.
Okay, this next portion is somewhat irrelevant. I mean, it's really wholly irrelevant. How history was viewed, and he's going, to give us a history lesson of how history was conducted. And he's going to try to tie it into where I bump it up to right now, but I'll just skip ahead. Here's good enough.
Era. Voltaire saw himself as part of that social development over the course of centuries that had driven humanity towards and into the French Revolution. But here at this point, I encourage you to stop and to take a moment of your time to think of this, especially if you yourself believe in there being a sort of progression of society and mankind throughout history. It may seem attractive to you, possibly even intuitive. History as a process of progress, developing before your eyes, a development of history that may comfortably fit into your beliefs over where society stands today and how it may possibly still develop into the future.
Again, is causality not a thing? Can we draw no paths from things that happened before to where things are going? I mean, there's a lot of stuff based on this, not just social science like econ, psych, and sociology, but, practical political considerations. For example, one of the big policies of during the Cold War, or during the end of the Cold War, when the Middle East started heating up, was maintaining sort of the Ottoman wall, which was essentially the boundary of the old Ottoman Empire to keep Russia sort of encircled. You have NATO to the west of Russia, and you have the Ottoman wall to the south, along with, of course, China and stuff, but that's not really the point. And for a large time, this is an objective of American power projection, to maintain the Ottoman wall and to keep Russia from projecting power into the Middle East. That's why Afghanistan was such a big deal under Reagan. And that was during the Cold War. Forget about when stuff started heating up. So, and I'll mention Afghanistan later, but can we draw no conclusions from these things? Can we not use them going forward? Like, every time he repeats it, it seems like the connotation is growing greater, that there's no point to drawing these conclusions, or that it's wrong to, in some shape or form. I'm not saying he's saying it's absolutely wrong, but in some shape or form it's wrong. Maybe I'm crazy, but that seems to be the case here.
But what such a line of thought leaves out of the equation is the state of mind and perspective of the people who drove forward this supposed progress. How did they perceive the movements and social changes, as well as the historical events of their time?
A fair question. Credit where credit is due. You need historical context, and that's something else Horkheimer kind of brings up in his essay on metaphysics and materialism. When he's talking about it, he makes a lot of normative claims in that essay. And so his justification for making normative claims isn't some greater metaphysical grounding. In fact, he's explicitly arguing against it in that essay. But what he is saying is that the basis will essentially be normative. That the historical context in which ethics is formed is all that really forms it. And so you need that cultural understanding in order to understand the values and traditions and ethical teachings of those people, which is true. I don't disagree with that. And Spengler makes that point as well, that you can't really properly universalize the principles of a people and try to export them globally unless you were to commit genocide on a mass scale and then be the only people left. And so the globe would be the only thing left to you. But, in lieu of that, you can't really export your morals to different people because they come from different cultural and ethnic backgrounds. And Hegel would put it as they have sort of a different national spirit or a different ethnos, which is kind of relating again to the philosophy of history. And Horkheimer, as a Marxist, would say it's different material conditions. But the point of the matter is, credit where credit's due. You need to take cultural considerations, material and spiritual, into account. Can jump a little bit forward here again.
And there is something else here that ought to be pointed out. Voltaire saw the French Revolution as the result of a progression of society, almost naturally. But it was his writings that had contributed to that revolution happening in the first place. History was being made by those who proclaimed to be the agents and executioners of history's will. So is this belief, in the end, nothing more but a self-fulfilling prophecy? Or even worse, a mere justification for one's actions that are supposed to instill a sense of meaning and purpose to one's politics rather than to history itself?
Interesting point. To answer that last question, that's what Horkheimer would say. Horkheimer would say, as he does in that essay, if I can find a PDF to it, I might as well link it in the description at this point because I'm referencing it so much. But in that essay, what Horkheimer would say is, yes, it's just a justification for the ruling class to oppress the lower classes. It's a very Nietzschean sort of power analysis type of thing, where the morality is made by the ruling class to keep them in power and to justify their rule. So Horkheimer would the answer to that question for Horkheimer would be yes. But in context of that whole sort of spiel that Kraut gave, a great man, like, why not both? Why can't there be linear theory and great man theory? Like, there's a lot of different modes to theories of history, like I mentioned before. And great man is just one of them. And linear and cyclical is just one of them. There's a lot more than those things. And none of them are really mutually exclusive, per se. So, implicitly advocating for one doesn't really dismiss the others. So, again, nothing really major against historicism here. Just you have a different spin on it, or you want to chalk it up to something like the everyman theory instead of the great man theory. I'll take a little bit of a break here because I'm about to do another big jump to 9:54. And I guess I'll go check what chat's been saying. Read 1C from www.iep.utm.epu. I think. What are you saying, Elmo? I can't. I'm trying to read it. I know it's a web address. Yeah, if you can't post the web address, I don't know what's up because I haven't turned that off in settings or anything or whatever. But yeah, I let things catch up a bit. I don't know where I'm at the moment, so maybe I'll go live. Yeah, if anybody else wants to say anything who's watching right now, now's your chance because I'm going to go back to telling Kraut he's dumb in just a second. All right. If I'll come back because there's a couple other big skips in there. What I kind of just skipped over was Kraut going over some material analyses of history, which again isn't really doing much to argue against the philosophy of history, which he's trying to set you up for the big debunking here. It's like, all these methods of history, Here they are. Here's these material analyses, and this is your philosophy debunked, even though all these material analyses don't even line up with your metaphysic. But we'll get to that at the end, and you'll see what I mean. So, to continue, I'll let this go for a while again.
In a critical essay he published, he criticized the until then common notions that had been used to research and review the Reformation and other historical time periods. The practice of reviewing past events through the lens of our current day and age, rather than attempting to see and interpret events through the lens of their time. An example being how the Reformation is stylized as a revolution caused by the misdeeds and incompetence of the Catholic Church, an interpretation of collectivist psychology, rather than attempting, for example, to see the Reformation as the result of individual drives and interactions as an assertion of self-determination by a newly formed, urban, and moderately wealthy citizenry of the late medieval period.
Okay, so again, he does this a lot. You're exchanging one group psychology for another. It's essentially going from great man / great men theory to everyman theory. So there's, of course, again, the implicit justification of a different theory of history, which I think he's trying to avoid. I think he's trying to come off as saying, you know, all theories of history are dumb and wrong, and while only addressing like cyclical theories and linear theory. But great man theory is wrong too, but here's everyman theory. This is the theory I'm advocating. So yeah, this is the one that's right. And again, it's just different group psychology. And again, it's this idea that the two are mutually exclusive. Like, the everyman can have a contribution to the shift in societal norms and stuff like that, and then that can be championed by a great man. Like, I don't think anyone doubts that the everymen were important to the American Revolution, but there's big doubts that if it weren't for George Washington, it would have gone as well as it did. And so again, these things, not mutually exclusive. It could have been the peasants and a new urban, wealthy middle class being discontent with Catholic rule. It could have also been the Catholic Church being, quote, overly oppressive. But of course, those of you who know me know my opinion of the Reformation and such. So again, he's talking about theories that aren't mutually exclusive, as if they were, and he's trading one psychology for another. I'm not saying it's dishonest, but I am saying it's poorly worded if he's trying to make a greater distinction between the two. So I'll jump ahead again. I didn't write down what I was skipping this time, but we're just jumping to 1131. Oh yeah, this is this other historian who wasn't an atheist, in short. All right, let's go.
Progression. This attempt by Fevre, Bloch, and their colleagues at viewing the past through the lens of the past, rather than through a modern context, gives us a more accurate picture of the past. It helps us understand history better than watching it through the perspective of an evolving history with the purpose to move towards a known or unknown goal.
Okay, so again, credit where credit is due. Presentism is bad. For those of you who don't know what presentism is the belief that we can apply modern mores to older political settings and judge peoples of the past based on our present morality, which is dumb and stupid. And you shouldn't view history that way either. So in sort of a roundabout way, he's doing a screed against presentism, which is fine. And I agree with that. So good for him. But again, different historical theories aren't mutually exclusive. I guess that's going to be the theme. I didn't even realize it as I was writing it down, but that's really going to be the theme. Cultural context doesn't eliminate a linear process of history. It just help explains the motions of that linear history. Because again, I don't think anybody claims it was a straight line to linear history. There's that atheist meme graph of the intelligence we lost during the Dark Ages and stuff. It's just the idea that there's a general trend line. If you do a scatter plot, you can find a linear trend line, even if it's not, a perfectly strong correlation. If the correlation isn't perfectly 1, the correlation is 0.7 instead. You can still get a trend line out of that. And I think that's how people view history. So it seems weird that, throughout this whole process. It just has to be the implication that it just has to be a straight line is weird. And also that, different cultures don't have their own sort of historical progress in the same thing. Or that cultural context somehow eliminates linear progress as opposed to just gives context to linear progress. But we continue.
Not only is the interpretation of past events through a modern lens wrong, but it guides us into political interpretations through the lens of our own biases, a standpoint from which we are easily entrapped into constructing political theories of history while feeling scientific in what we do, while in fact only appeasing our own notions of desired outcomes.
Okay, so again, credit where credit is due. Presentism, bad. It does cause a lot of political guilt. Presentism essentially is what's used against Germans 24/7 to say, oh, you did World War II, you're bad. And that recent thing with Jordan Peterson where a clip of him on the H3 podcast came up, and it's him trying to explain the psychological and cultural conditioning of what brought about Nazism is a good point. Jordan Peterson is a very good anti-presentist because he understands that things don't happen in a vacuum and there's a context for a lot of this stuff. So we really can't pass judgment on the peoples of the past, even as recently as 1940, whatever. At the same point, this is also a very this is also a very critical theory kind of point to make. Because, again, one of the things Horkheimer suggested in that essay, Materialism and Metaphysics, is that morality is just meant to please us in the present. Specifically, he says the ruling class, but he also mentions the use of pragmatism and utilitarianism being co-opted for materialist liberal ends and such. You know what? To that effect, let me see if I can find the exact quote, because I think I might have actually highlighted that. I prepare with all these little notes, but I don't write down page numbers in books. Am I going too far? Okay, cool. Here's the little passage which I'll read from, and this is Horkheimer in his essay Materialism and Metaphysics. The idea of unbroken harmony between reality and reason belongs to the liberalist phase. So let it be known here, I think the first person to use the word liberalist, or in a critical sort of philosophical and historical analysis, is Horkheimer. So liberalists are cultural Marxists because Horkheimer was a cultural Marxist and he founded the Frankfurt School, yada, yada, yada. So go meme that into the internet and whatnot. But anyway, to continue. It corresponds to social and economic. It corresponds to social economy marked by a plurality of individual entrepreneurs. The image of their interests as harmonizing and producing frictionless functioning of the whole economy was applied to society as a whole and to its various social classes. The monopolistic phases goes even further in denying class conflicts, but the struggle in the world market between a few power groups has become so much the principal theme of the period that instead of harmony between individuals, such concepts as tragedy, heroism, and destiny have come to be the main categories for a philosophy of history. The material interests of individuals are considered unimportant, something less to be fulfilled than to be overcome. So this is the use of metaphysics and history to sort of, in this case, subvert the working class, but to justify liberalist ends. So Horkheimer calling out the liberalists, liberalist owned. There might be another passage that was a little bit better. In fact, I think there was, but if I'm able to find it is another question. Oh, yes. Okay, so here we go. This passage is the one that's actually better. Am I boring people with this? I'll go to chat. Basically, Krautshovid. Does chat want to hear me? Am I still live? Yeah, okay. Does chat want to hear me read another section of Horkheimer? Because I'll do it. Don't tempt me. Yeah, all right. Really quickly, I suppose. I'll just read this quick section because this is actually the more relevant section, and perhaps I'll highlight it and doggy mark it for next time. But this is on page 22 of Critical Theory Selected Essays by Max Horkheimer. In urging the universal application of moral principles on which the existing order of things was founded, the ruled have changed the meaning of these principles without making any new metaphysical justification necessary. The cry during the Peasant Wars that Christianity should be applied gave Christianity a new meaning as compared with the current understanding of it. Similarly, the demand that the bourgeois ideal of justice should be universally fulfilled led to the criticism and overthrow of that society, a free exchange in which the show of the contradiction between principle on which the bourgeoisie society was founded and the actual reality of that society involves bringing out how justice was one-sidedly defined in terms of freedom and freedom of terms of negation, and substituting a positive conception of justice by offering a ground plan for a reasonable society. When the concept of justice thus changes its meaning, we glimpse the historical origins of what was originally proclaimed as an eternal principle, and we understand that concept was an idea proposed by definite individuals and conditioned by relations within a class society. Today, therefore, the struggle for a better order of things has been cut loose from its old supernatural justification. That is Horkheimer again. And again, that's in a roundabout way somewhat the point Kraut is making. I don't believe Kraut is a cultural Marxist, quote unquote, whatever the hell that means. And I don't think Kraut subscribes to any amount of critical theory per se, but it's certainly interesting how much the points overlap. Because really what critical theory is an attempt to get away from sort of scientific Marxism and materialism and almost a little bit more idealistic. And so in another roundabout way, it's also a very Hegelian point. Because again, Marxism based on Hegelianism and Frankfurt School and critical theory based on Marxist theory. So A is similar to B is similar to C. Again, not accusing Kraut of this at all, not even ironically so. It's just funny how similar the points he makes are to that school of thought and how they end up being more Hegelian sometimes than he realizes in that sense. And to continue on. Where's the mouse? Oh, whoops.
A fairly good recent example can be seen within the last 10 years. It plays around the notion of there being a historic destiny. More precisely, that certain points in history serve as points of learning, that they are repetitive, that they move in waves, and as such, have the constant same outcome, that certain actions are destined to have a predetermined outcome no matter what. But
okay, so on that point, let me go back to that graphic because that graphic is somewhat important because it's a little bit misleading. I don't think anybody says Russia can't be successfully invaded. I think the point is that it can't be successfully invaded during the winter. I think that's a more accurate interpretation, and I think that's a little bit of a straw man on Kraut's part. Or possibly, this is what they taught him in fucked up German/English history school, which he probably failed anyway. But whatever. So I think this is somewhat of a bit of a straw man. But even so, it's less of a historical lesson of, history repeats itself, and more of the idea that this is a tactical point, that you shouldn't invade Russia during the winter because it'll be incredibly hard and you'll probably lose. It's kind of like hedging your bets. Again, why can't we draw historical parallels? Why is that bad? Or why shouldn't we do it? It's weird because it makes sense to say don't invade Russia in the winter. I know Kraut wouldn't. If Kraut were the leader of some army, I would hope he'd be smart enough to say, no, we shouldn't invade Russia in the winter. Leading the skeptic forces against reactionary Russia in the coming EU/NATO versus Russia war. I'd like to hope he wouldn't make the dumb suggestion of invading Russia in the winter. But he seems to be implying that you shouldn't make that suggestion. Very odd. And we'll get to something else that's weird.
What? But do they really?
Okay, so the examples he has here. Two of them are kind of political anomalies, and they all sort of speak to the same strategy. So first, the Mongols. The Mongols were sort of a historical anomaly in that they were a tribe of horse archers and swordsmen and spearmen who came from the Mongolian steppe to what we consider the Western world, essentially out of nowhere. I just watched that little extra credits channel and the presentation they kind of gave on Genghis Khan. No clue if any of it's accurate. And they certainly do try to paint, a very friendly picture of this guy who is supposedly the father of at least, or the direct descendant of, or the direct ancestor of at least 6% of Mongolians because of all the rape. But this was just an unmitigated war machine, the likes of which the world had never known, hence why he was able to create the largest empire ever. And he also came at Russia from a direction no other force in history had really tried to invade it from, which was from the east, where, there wasn't a lot of Russians out that way to begin with anyway. And so when he finally got to the other side, the Slavs were like, this hasn't happened in a while, because the last time it happened was some, I guess, 300 years or so ago, when the Huns strolled in with Attila. And so, they were used to, of course, facing threats kind of on the Western front, be it like Norse pagans or the Holy Roman Empire or the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Polish victory. But the Mongol victory is somewhat of an anomaly. Not because it wasn't expected, but because the tactics were different and everything was so radically different from anything Russia had faced before. The Polish victory, to do it in chronological, is kind of the only one that makes sense. At the same time, you could say that because of the territory the Poles owned, they were also somewhat accustomed to the cold winter. They probably knew not to wage war in the winter. I don't know the tactics of that war in particular, so I can't say. But I don't think it's fair to call it, this example kind of disproves the idea that it's bad to invade Russia in the winter, which is the proper statement again. And then the German victory was kind of an act of political sabotage because they sent Lenin back on a train to say, go screw up the Russian battlefront and things like that. Go foment revolution. And even then, the whole idea behind the Schlieffen Plan wasn't even to invade Russia. It was to sit on the Eastern Front with Austria-Hungary and just prevent Russia from gaining ground in the East. It was the exact opposite of an invasion. So, they took a little bit of territory, and the idea was, maybe, the Russians throw enough bodies at it, inch forward a bit. But the idea wasn't to outright invade Russia. That was not the Schlieffen Plan. And so, again, this is a gross historical inaccuracy that you think Kraut as a German would have a better understanding of, especially the Schlieffen Plan. But whatever. Anyway, we're going to skip around a bit again. This time, what Kraut's skipping is talking about Afghanistan as the graveyard of empires and things like that. And he's making the same point essentially here. It's like, it wasn't really the graveyard of empires because look at all these. And if you see my little hand here, he's giving all the names of empires that kind of run through it before we even get to a modern conception of Afghanistan and all that. Which is true, if you've ever seen The Men Who Would Be King, great movie starring Michael Caine and Sean Connery. Wow, almost forgot that. They talk about the fact that, the British sort of had formal rule over it during that time period, but it was essentially just land of desert and brutal mountains that nobody really bothered to unify. And the whole idea that Michael Caine and Sean Connery were embarking on was that those two men could go and claim that they were gods, unite the people of Afghanistan, and rule themselves as king. So the trouble wasn't that, it's the graveyard of empires because it can't be invaded or it can't be managed. The idea was that you invade Afghanistan and that's kind of it. Again, it's another tactical point too. Afghanistan is a logistical hellhole because of all the mountains and how divided it is, because of the deserts and things like that, because of all this tribal separation. A comparison might be Italy pre-unification, because Giuseppe Garibaldi had a lot of unifying to do. There were, by his time, a couple of main Italian city-states, but for a large period during the Renaissance and the Reformation, it was just a small group of like city-states that would go to war with each other. St. Francis of Assisi embarked on a crusade he embarked on a crusade and then he embarked on a war. He also embarked on wars against other Italian city-states because he was looking for fame and such. So this idea, Italy wasn't a political unity. But at the same time, Italy also isn't the graveyard of empires. It's just this idea that it's incredibly hard to manage because of its geography, and it's a logistical hell. And so usually by the time empires get to it, you're pretty much spent, and that's pretty much it for you. You conquer Afghanistan, that's it. And your empire just kind of dies and fades away or gets invaded by another empire, which funnily enough is the point that Kraut goes on to make.
There was no consistency, no repeating historical trend from which one could conclude a predetermined outcome other than the continued change of rulers over 3,000 years.
So there is a pattern. And that's the fact that Afghanistan constantly changes hands because you invade it and it's a territory you can never really hang on to because of the logistical hell that it is. And so other empires try to take down your empire by chipping away at the weakest part of you. And so I'm not saying they start by invading Afghanistan, but Afghanistan is usually the first to go when you look at empires. Of course, after Alexander conquered the known world and his generals kind of split stuff up, you didn't really hear much from the people out in the Indus River Valley out in Afghanistan again. You heard from the people who would eventually become the Parthians and the Seleucids and things like that. And, some of their Ptolemaic ancestry to some extent, but not much from out there because the second the Greeks got there, it was such a logistical hellhole that, they kind of went back and then it was taken up by somebody else and somebody else. So there is a pattern there, and it is accurate to call it the graveyard of empires because nobody can hold on to it. And if you try to, one, you're wasting resources, and it probably means your empire is about to die anyway. Take that for what you will with the American invasion of Afghanistan. But let us continue.
By, however, looking at the history of a part of Asia through a European lens, by forgetting that this place has its own history outside of European involvement, by viewing it through the lens of one's own political biases, and by attempting to pin a meaning and purpose to the passage of history, a warped and in the end wrong image of reality is created. And such a warped view of reality through the application of a theory of history will not only distort your view of the past, but also of the present.
Okay, so again, yes, presentism bad. I've given him enough credit on that. But also, why is it wrong? Like the thing all these articles are sort of acknowledging tacitly, and I've only gone through like 2 or 3 of them. But the theme is Afghanistan is a logistical hellhole to manage. It's not worth the time there. And we've known this for a while now. Why are we doing it again? It's again, why is it wrong to draw historical parallels? I'm going to say the few same things over and over again because it seems like Kraut has this problem against induction and learning from the past. Like he genuinely doesn't believe the motto, those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it, which, isn't true in a specific deterministic way, but isn't truer in a broader historical sense, which is something Kraut actually went on about in one of his other videos where he's afraid of Nazis and fascists and ethnostatists and things like that. It's like, if we don't learn how Mussolini and Hitler came to power, we can't stop them. So it seems like this video is directly contradicting some of his older ones through the implications he's making. Again, they're all implications. I can only draw so much from it. I can only read context so much, but it seems odd. It seems very, very odd. But continuing.
And what is historical progression. How do we define a social evolution throughout history, or better put, progress within a society over time? How do we judge if a society has progressed and moved into a place that elevated it from a past state? Because if you believe in such a thing, there are questions that surface. What is your standard for progress? What makes you believe that a certain situation is an improvement of a previous situation?
So, not a bad question, admittedly, but all you have to do is pick a standard and then try to measure it. And, you can do that. The standard you pick is subjective, I suppose, depending on the historicist you are dealing with. But you can indeed pick a standard and then indeed try to measure it. I kind of like to go along with Hegel's idea of moving towards the absolute, but instead of putting it in terms of an idealist metaphysic, I put it in terms of, dualism. We'll never reach God. We'll never reach the rational society, and we'll never become one with, the absolute, or Brahman, as you might put it if you're from an Eastern faith, or philosophy again. But, St. Augustine put it best when he said, "Our hearts, Lord, are restless until they rest in you." And so I'd say civilization is sort of all of humanity trying to quiet that restlessness. And I think personally, there's somewhat of a cyclical nature to it, and there's somewhat linear to it, because we never go back. It's like you keep following the sine wave along the x-axis. The sine wave might look the same as it did when you were at 1 on the sine axis, but it's not the same point, even though it might be at the same elevation on the y-axis that you got to, but it's still not the same. So I think there's a blending of linear and cyclical that can happen, in my opinion. But again, one theory of history isn't mutually exclusive to the rest. Whether one is better than the other is debatable and really not even materially determinable per se. And you can't act like, there isn't a theory of history, because people will always have theories of histories. Again, see Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is a big advocate of the geographical theory of history and things like that. But, things don't have to be clear. Again, there doesn't have to be a clear cyclical trend. There doesn't have to be a clear linear trend. There just has to be a trend line that can be drawn if you were to throw history up and make it a scatter plot. But you can measure it. Saying, "Oh, how do you choose?" Well, that's a philosophical question. Fine, we can debate that. Well, then once you have a standard, how do you measure it? We can debate that too. And maybe it can be philosophically debated, and maybe it can be materially debated depending on the standard. But this isn't just a question you can throw out and act like there's not an answer to. There's a lot of answers to it, and we can debate them all. Continuing.
This might sound simple to you, but on second thought you will realize that it really isn't. What some may call progress, others may define as a regression and collapse. And what you may define as a regression, others may define as a return to norm or progress. The thought process of seeing history as a human social evolution with purpose and predictive power automatically puts in the room the notion of there being a destiny, a goal, a status towards which society can strive towards. And it is what that status may be where the difficulties arise. In the latter half of the 20th century, the ideology that embraced this historicism and confronted the liberal democracies of the world was Marxism, which has its theories grounded in historical materialism and the idea that through an analysis of history, it can predict and determine the outcome of historical developments for mankind in the future.
Okay, so I missed one right there, but if we go back and address the earlier part of that statement, we can strive without reaching a definitive end. Again, there's some question to what Hegel meant by striving towards the absolute and whether he thought there was an actual end of history. It seems to be believed that he thought there was, but you could make the case that the dialectic was never meant to end and that it was just supposed to keep going and going and going, and we'd just keep getting better and better and better without really a specific end. That's what I believe, sort of, in some sense, at least when I apply it to the dualist metaphysic, because history doesn't end until in my opinion, Christ himself comes down from the heavens and we are all to be judged by him. That's when history ends, not when every country in the world adopts liberal democracy like Francis Fukuyama says, and not when we reach, a worker's paradise like Marx might have put it, but only when the king returns. But anyway, we can strive to be with the king even though he's not coming, and we can make improvements. There's strives we can make and get better along the way without reaching the end goal. Like, that's kind of like the idea behind it's not the destination that matters, it's the journey. And, that's very cheesy and it's just a platitude. But there's something to folk wisdom. You can, even if you don't reach your goal and you fall short, you can still be better than you were before. And society can be better than it was before. And if I just replay that last little bit here, if you'll excuse me, because I missed some of it.
Status may be where the difficulties arise. In the latter half of the 20th century, the ideology that embraced this historicism and confronted the liberal democracies of the world was Marxism, which has its theories grounded in historical materialism and the idea that through an analysis of history, it can predict and determine the outcome of historical developments for mankind in the future.
Okay, so you get into Marxist lit and you listen to Marxist talk, and this, this isn't exactly the case, because there's a lot of Marxist theories, there's a lot of different Marxist writings, there's a lot of different schools of Marxism, and so some Marxist schools, the more scientific type, would say, yes, we can definitely predict the end of society, and this is how it will come about. Others say you can't, and that it's just a general end goal that will come about in some way, shape, or form eventually, but there's no direct path there. We just have to keep pushing the dialectic forward. Others say that, we can kind of throw out determinism because we have no idea what the end result is going to look like, pretty much. Like, who knows what actually has to change, whether it's just the material conditions of capitalist production or literally us as humans. Zizek is a big sort of, not endorser of transhumanism to some extent, but he says he believes if we are to embrace full communism, we are going to have to be more than human. I think that belief is somewhat rooted in Hegel's own Prot belief of the perfectibility of man, carried over to an extreme. And I think the perfectibility of man that comes from Protestant ideology and Hegel kind of evolves into a hatred of the human being as himself in Marxism. That's why, Zizek isn't the only one to talk about the destruction of man as himself. You need to create a new communist man. This concept isn't new. But again, it depends on the Marxist. I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit here. Babadoop. Bow.
The 19th century gave birth to nationalism, the idea that a nation was no longer just defined by its rulers, but by ethnicity, language, and even faith. Within this term...
Minor point, and I'll continue, and I'll skip a little ahead again. All nations were pretty much formulated that way. It's built into the etymology of the word nation, which comes from the Latin word natio, nascere, nashi, natus, I believe, is the full form of the word, and it literally means to be born, or that's the infinitive of the word, I should say. But it comes from, this idea of, same word, by the way, nativity comes from. It comes from this idea of being born into a nation, and it comes from this idea of ethnos, which you can go back to the Hebrews and the Greeks and find. Like, it's not even right to say it's been formalized in the 19th century, which is what I wrote down. It's been formalized for a while. It's formalized in the Bible. It's formalized in the Greeks when they formed the Delian League. It's formalized in the Romans when they formed the Roman kingdom and expel the Etruscans or conquer them, and how they go about conquering other people later on in the empire and who does and doesn't get citizenship. Now, granted, it's not purely a racial construct. There's some spirituality to it, something Spengler kind of builds on later on, but it's also not purely materialist either. But these are all things that have been common historical notions pretty much throughout history, and not really just this new idea formalized even in the 19th century. It became more vocal in the 19th century because the idea of liberal democracy and self-rule was beginning to emerge, and it was self-rule applied to various ethnicities. That's what Woodrow Wilson endorsed. That's why he wanted to give self-rule to the people of the Balkans and break up Austria-Hungary, because it was ethnic self-rule. But, it's been a thought for a long time. Again, you can go watch a Ryan Falk video about how the founding fathers wanted the country to just be white people and the laws they passed. It's clear that this has been the underlying backbone of civilization for some time. Whether you believe it to be a spiritual basis or a material basis is besides the point. Nation and ethnos are inextricably linked, and it's only been an aberration of really the past 100 years or so that has tried to separate the two concepts. We're in the home stretch here, but I'll just go back to check on chat. The notion I missed a lot of stuff. Sorry, guys. That notion betrays liberal anthropology, in which the state is optional. I don't know. Rodin, boo. Yeah, yo. Are you the first principles liberal? Are you the first principles liberal or not? Is the state optional or not? I'm not a liberal. I think I said that at the beginning of the video. I'm not a liberal. The state is not an option. The state is something that permanently exists as its own metaphysical entity. So I'll read what you have to say, though, while I take this quick break. The sovereign state disperses possession. I'm going to assume you mean disperses possessions to his subject, and then codifies it in institutions such as law, which then constitutes property, which in turn is different from simple possession. Yeah, that'd be Hoppe's take on the whole thing. I don't agree with Hoppe's take, though, because it's too reductionist. You can't reduce the functioning of states to property needs alone. There are spiritual and psychological needs that a state fulfills, sometimes by the things it does, but oftentimes simply through its mere existence. And this is something that pretty much a lot of different fields confirm, except liberalism, pretty much. Like a Lacanian psychoanalysis has something about it. Neoconservatism, which is just a different variety of liberalism. Obviously, the reactionary conception, certain Marxist conceptions. Pretty much everybody understands that a kind of state needs to exist to serve some usefulness, whether in the things it does or simply by existing, except the libertarians. But, libertarians. Nation states formed in the 16th century with Westphalia. I mean, yeah, the formal thing of what we know today as nation states was formalized in Westphalia in the 16th century. But the idea of states and nations and being tied to ethnos and bodies of governance being tied to ethnos, whether you call it a state or not, has existed since the beginning of time, I think, pretty much. Consent is a spook. Ultimate legitimacy is absolutism. Agreed. I never claimed that was the sole reason for the state. I am delineating between liberal theory of property and absolutist conceptions. Well, fair enough. I'm an absolutist in that sense, so you don't got to worry about that. Also, crowd is trying too hard to dunk on the alt-right. It's so pathetic. Yeah, this video is a really bad attempt at dunking on the alt-right, and you'll see that as we continue. You claim the state is the poison of the people living there in your immigration debate. Is the possession? Yes. This implies that the state is optional. No, the people own it, but they own it whether they want to or not. Again, you can have sort of a propertarian justification for the state, or a propertarian justification of the right of the people to own the state without claiming the state is optional. Like, you don't get to abandon. It's more than property. Again, the state is also its own metaphysical entity that, the state owns the people and the people own the state. And there is this indeterminable tension between the two, as Slavoj Žižek, or not Slavoj Žižek, perhaps the postmodernists might say. But it exists for a reason, and as much as the state owns the people own the state still. And it is their possession in as much as they can decide the makeup of it. Property only makes sense in the corporative sense, takes into account of matter and essence. That's another thing that has one of those indeterminable tensions, the indeterminable tension between the relation of every individual person to certain pieces of property and the essence of that property itself. But we still know enough that, we give enough credence to Lockean property theory to say that we own things. Maybe it's not Lockean property theory, but you catch my drift. Continuing on now. All right. We only got a little bit left here, people. We're in the home stretch.
Turbulent age, which saw uprisings around the formation of a modern national identity.
Oh, wait, I was meant to skip ahead a bit. There we go.
Nations. If we read the historians of that time, such as Heinrich von Treitschke, we notice a considerable change in tone and narrative from the 18th century. Treitschke wrote almost condemningly of the chaos and confusion of regional states, decried enemies of the German race and nation from the outside, such as Slavs, socialists, liberals, Jews, and Anglo-Saxons. He wrote his texts in the shape of grand national histories. History was not a struggle between kings or a summary of individual actions and stories, but the story of a grand natural struggle of dominance between races and nations. And this
gotta love the music shift there, first and foremost. But also, this idea that history excludes nations and individuals are excluded from the national history-making process is odd to me. Are their actions not up for consideration? If you're talking about group site, if you're talking about the everyman theory, the everyman is a part of a nation one way or another. There's really no purely international person or internationalist man. Draw your own conclusions and such. But, it's stupid to discount the actions of nations as if they aren't political and real entities and pretend that history is only taking place on the individual level. Again, it's this microcosmic, hyper-reductionist view of history that just, doesn't really account for everything. And that's why we have grand narratives, because they do tell a truth, not simply through this Jordan Peterson type idea of meaning and archetypes, but they relay a real story about the people. And, Manifest Destiny became, and the Revolution, that used to be the national mythos of the United States. And it told of an industrious people who fought against a tyrant overseas, wrongly in my opinion now, but to create their own way. But, it does tell a story, and there's a lot of truth to it, even if it sort of glosses over some of the negative parts, or what people perceive to be the negative parts. Just because something is a narrative doesn't make it wrong. So we shall continue.
This trend of viewing history as a struggle between nations and peoples and races can be found throughout the 19th century. Its origins lie within the counter-revolution of the early 19th century and its leading figure, Hegel.
Get my man's name out your mouth is my Mimi moment there. But in all honesty, some people say he's a champion of the Enlightenment through the counter-revolution. It depends how you view Napoleon. But either way, he's not in particular a German nationalist or a racial nationalist especially. Again, he sort of had a conception of Greek ethnos to some extent embroiled into his thing if you read his philosophy of history. So, and again, I know he hasn't because no sources except this one book, The Poverty of Historicism, and the few essays he mentions, but none of them prior to this are actually about Hegel. He doesn't once, and you'll see as we go on, mention a piece of literature or quote a piece of literature from Hegel. I can only assume his quotes about Hegel are all from The Poverty of Historicism by Karl Popper, who's a disgusting liberal. And I can only assume how horribly rendered out of context and misinterpreted they are. Sort of like the article by Murray Rothbard we just read. Weird. It's like all liberals are hell-bent on just misinterpreting Hegel to no end. Real crazy, that coincidence there, isn't it? But to continue.
Butler saw history as the playground of nations and races, a field upon which the system of state, the values and virtues of cultures and races were put to test through conflict and war. That war between nations was a necessity and merely a natural struggle due to an ongoing historical struggle of nations and their races.
Citation needed. Citation needed. Especially from the racial thing, because the way he means race is completely different from the concept of ethnos, which you could argue includes a concept of material race, but is also spiritual. And Hegel, being idealist, was only talking about this spiritual ideal. And, there's mention in the Bible of people joining the tribe of Israel and its ethnos, at least spiritually so. When you go to Japan, no matter how much you adopt the culture, and no matter how well liked you are by the native Japanese, you're pretty much always a gaijin. But, you can do a lot to honor the culture and be spiritually accepted in Japan, I suppose would be the way to put it. But this idea that Hegel was like a material racist in the fashion of like a David Duke or some sort of like George Lincoln Rockwell is absolutely complete revisionist trash. And he has no citations for it whatsoever. Utter garbage. Continuing.
Hegel is the father of historicism as a political theory.
Wrong. Hegel is the father of historicism as a philosophical belief that humans are moving towards a net good and a greater good in society, not political. The way in which Hegel believes the rational society or the rational community should be ordered can almost be completely separated from historical determinism. He believes it will get us there faster, or he'll believe that's what society looks like right before the end. But this idea that, this idea that it's just a political event and that his politics are based on it is not true in the slightest. Again, no citations. And to address a point I sort of missed earlier about, races going to war and it being necessary, he did see the process of dialectic shifts being bloody sometimes. He did think war was necessary to that extent. But again, it wasn't on a materially racist racial basis. He just saw certain nations embodying certain ideals, and what was really happening was those universal ideals asserting themselves against other ideals or the particular versions of those ideals that didn't happen to quite line up with the absolute. This is a theory of war that Slavoj Žižek actually endorsed in another lecture I listened to of his. I can't find it off the top of my head, but it's this idea that we'll always have war because universes will always be asserting themselves against their particulars, which don't quite match up to the form. It's like saying we'll always, to put it in a Platonic sense, we'll always have wars because, the circles we have down here will never be the perfect circles. That's obviously an absurd thing to say, but it's, apply that to concepts like freedom and justice and liberty, and you basically get why we'll always have wars, because the concept of freedom and liberty will never be perfectly what we can have on here. And Hegel believed eventually we would get to that through war. I don't, but I still find it a good justification for why we will always have war. But again, it's not a racist thing. Like, to read racism into Hegel is dumb and stupid. But to continue.
Hegel's historicism also dictates a purpose to history and a progression of mankind throughout it towards an end goal. However, in Hegel's view, the goal of this progress and the final most virtuous of all societies was not a proletariat's paradise or a liberal egalitarianism, but the authoritarian and absolutist Prussian state, that all races and nations had strived towards domination and perfection, and the one that had achieved such was the Prussian state. through an authoritarian ruthlessness and militarism that squashed the chaos of the French Revolution.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack in that little segment right there, and I wrote down a lot in big capital letters on my notepad here. First off, I don't even know where to begin. So the thing Hegel is glorifying here isn't any sort of particularly authoritarian system. It was basically just constitutional monarchy, which England had too, and I don't think they were particularly authoritarian at the time. Maybe they weren't perfectly liberal, but they weren't fascism. You know, they weren't this big spook Kraut likes to make out. And really, it wasn't even that bad. If you read Prussianism and Socialism by Spengler, it's this idea that it's not simply militarism that puts things in order for the sake of militarism, but it's the idea of civic virtue and rationality. And that's what Hegel liked about it. It was the idea of an organically rational society moving closer to the absolute, which he enjoyed. Nothing about conflict in particular, or about racial identity in particular. This is all such reading into Hegel. And it's throwing out everything he talked about earlier in the video, such as cultural context and not judging the past by our present values, our present mores. So the same cultural context he talks about with Weber is completely thrown out when he looks at Hegel and his writings, because one of the things to point out, and Peter Singer goes over this in his book, Hegel, A Very Short Introduction, is the fact that Hegel was essentially a Prussian state intellectual. He went on to teach. He was obviously taught at Tübingen, but he was also went on to teach at Jena. He went on to go back to teach at Berlin and Nuremberg. So he was a big state intellectual guy, and he became quite popular for it. And so one of the things he had to do was kiss up to the Prussian oligarchy, monarchy, so forth and so on. Otherwise, you kind of get the boot, or at the very least, you lose your funding. And so, cultural context. Weird how it suddenly doesn't apply to the person you're making the case against, isn't it? And it's weird how, you're trying to apply this present moral scope of things as if, authoritarianism is the big bad that we're moving away from, that we're progressing away from. Weird. It's this implicit idea that we're sort of moving away from authoritarianism because it's bad for some reason. But I don't know. Maybe these inconsistencies are all just in my head. But, I'll try to find the line. I'll read a little bit from Singer. This is page, bottom of page 10 onto page 11. I don't know how much of it I'll read, but I'll just read it a bit because it says important things. Life at Jena had been disrupted by the French occupation. Now that the university had closed down, Hegel worked for a year as a newspaper editor, and then accepting the headmastership of the academic high school at Nuremberg. He remained in his post for 9 years and made a success of it. In addition to the more usual suspects, he taught his school boys philosophy. What they made of his lectures is not known. In Nuremberg, Hegel's domestic life became settled. At Jena, he had fathered an illegitimate son, and mother being his landlady, who is recorded as having had 2 previous illegitimate children by other lovers in 1811. Age 49, Hegel married half engaged. And during these years, Hegel published his lengthy Science of Logic, which appeared in 3 volumes in 1812, 1813, and 1816. His works were now gained wider appreciation in 1816, and he was invited to take the post of professor of philosophy at University of Heidelberg. There he wrote Encyclopedia of okay, here we go. Hegel's reputation was now so great that the Prussian Minister of Education asked him to take up the prestigious chair of philosophy at the University of Berlin. The Prussian educational system had benefited from the reforms of von Stein and von Hardenberg, and Berlin was becoming the intellectual center of all the German states. Hegel accepted the offer with alacrity and taught at Berlin from 1818 until he died in 1831. Now, that's just the historical context. Let me try to find specifically his concept of the rational society. Yes, I'm humming and I'm quiet because I'm trying to find it. I'm sorry. I can't read and talk at the same time. I'm a stupid idiot. Okay. Maybe I don't have the right section here, but if it's not in the chapter of history with a purpose, it's going to be in the chapter with freedom and community. Again, that's Hegel, a very short introduction. I should have prepared better. But we're final stretch. I'll finish this up and I'll go back to look at comments. So if you have any, I will read them. But again, Kraut throwing out cultural context and reintroducing presentism, the snap of a finger, just because he's making the case against this person now. So we continue.
Of course, where's Prussia today? It may be gone, but Hegel's ideas of a historic destiny lived on, like an undead being resurfacing
evil
from time
Hegel
to time
glare
to rear its ugly head, be it as pointing out the supposed destiny of a German people or the virtues of an isolated Spain.
More Nazis, more fascists. It's like, historical context and presentism don't matter once you're talking about the baddies who we're supposed to be progressing away against, guys. We got to progress away from the fascism, and we got to endorse my notion of historical progress, even though I don't believe in historical progress. What a dunce. What an idiot.
To this day forming the backbone of thought for the modern believers in a chosen race and its destiny.
This is, again, bullshit to the highest degree. I've never read the White Nationalist Manifesto by Greg Johnson. Perhaps he quotes and cites Hegel a few times. I know Richard Spencer does for a fact. But again, they're reading into Hegel what's not there. They're reading into Hegel a materialist interpretation of race that's absolutely not present in Hegel whatsoever. And he doesn't have a source for this either. Again, he's read nothing about Hegel in the slightest. Like, maybe according to the few nut jobs who make up the remaining alt-right, this is true, but most Hegel scholars, even those who aren't explicitly left, would strongly disagree. And I imagine, you could get something else if you actually decided to read a little Hegel, Kraut. I imagine you'd enjoy it. But he's not going to see this. So we continue.
What historic progression or cycles within history are, and what a society progresses towards, lies entirely within the ideological eye of the beholder, and can be anything from communism to an absolute monarchy, to a caliphate, to a primitivist collectivism, to a 1,000-year Reich. What one person may see as progress, the other may see as a degenerate regression hindering progress. Seeing history as something with purpose is misleading and dangerous, and it gives one the delusion of destiny and of service to a greater purpose that forms the justification for actions one would normally deem as unacceptable.
Unacceptable was what he was going to say. I'm just cutting it off there because, this is a stupid point. Because this is ideology. This is modern ideology. I'm so against the blood on your hands argument, no matter who uses it, whether it's neoliberals against communists or neoliberals against fascists or communists against fascists. Every ideology has blood on its hands. The liberalism of John Stuart Mill and John Locke was used to justify the reign of terror by the French. And it was used to justify something that you might not otherwise deem morally acceptable. And you might say, oh, but that's not real liberalism. But guess what? It was still used as the basis for the reign of terror. And all that blood is on liberalism's hands because it was the ideology on which the justification was based. The same thing can be said about communism. The same thing can be said about fascism. If you have a dominant ideology of the culture, chances are it's going to be used as the maxim to which otherwise immoral things at the time might be done. This is simply the state of ideology. That's the only way to put it. Screw it. I'll go back to Horkheimer for a second, because Horkheimer has another good quote to this effect, which is earlier on, which I highlighted for once, and I sent to Dr. Lehman because his next stream is going to be on ideology. But, quote, from this is from a different essay. This is on Horkheimer's essay, Notes on Science and the Crisis. Every human way of acting which hides the true nature of society, built as it is on contrarieties, is ideological. And the claim that philosophical, moral, and religious acts of faith, scientific theories, legal maxims, and cultural institutions have this function is not an attack on the character of those who originate them, but only states the objective role such realities play in society. This kind of, again, plays into the idea that all institutions have their own morality, which really isn't universal, but they try to universalize. But more importantly, it plays into this idea that, yes, societies use whatever the dominant ideology is to justify whatever they think they need to do. So this is dumb virtue signaling. The blood on your hands argument of like, oh, communists killed 100 million or something. The Nazis killed 12 gurillion, applies literally to any ideology, and it's dumb. Argue the merits of the ideology based on what you think the outcome should be. Use metaphysics. It is a tool, as much as it is a way of learning, to continue.
Acceptable. The re-emergence of that idea is troublesome, even more so because few seem to be questioning the very process of using history as a means of a political method itself. But
again, anything is a political method, dummy. Anything and everything is a political method. I can start a religion around Fig Newtons, and I can use it as the justification for having the women who join my cult, cut off their left pinky finger in honor to be a show of loyalty. Things you don't... Anything can be ideology. Anything. And ideology will be used to justify whatever it thinks it needs to. This is such a dumb point. This is a dumb point made by dumb people. Continuing.
But even more because it is not merely restricted to the discourse on the internet. It has seeped itself into our modern politics, where it has been picked up by a new generation of ideologues. And
I didn't originally have a pause planned here, but if you're concerned about Richard Spencer as an ideologue, you're a weak loser. Because Richard Spencer and his cult following of other weird losers is dead. And he's only brought up as a boogeyman in the same capacity in which Gamergate is still brought up as a boogeyman. Neither of those things had a real impact on the body politic, and yet they're constantly brought up as things to just bash people over the head with. So stop worrying about this loser.
Forms the basis of self-justification for modern-day authoritarian states. If you don't believe me, pick up a Chinese school book with which hundreds of millions of Chinese children are raised to understand and see the world, and read in it about how the Chinese communist one-party state is supposedly the progression of society out of the chaos of a multi-party system.
Again, I talked about this earlier when I didn't mean to, but I'll say it again. National mythoses are a thing. They are a form of ideology. They will be used to justify whatever. But they all contain truth, again, maybe to varying degrees. Maybe the national mythos of China has less truth in it than the national mythos of the early American state in the form of the revolution and Manifest Destiny. But it's still a form of ideology that's going to be used, and everything can be ideology. Prove me wrong. I'll wait. Pro tip, you can't. And we're just going to go through to the final
In
minutes
line with
here.
my personal thinking of history is the historian Max Weber. History consists of individual relations and events, and it is not the job of those who study history to develop from it a social science or ideology to guide our way. Because history does not show the way.
All right, and we get a little, nice little highlight reel of garbage at the end. But, yep. that's that. That dumb idiot talks about Hegel because he doesn't know anything about Hegel. But it's a good example of what not to do. And someone pointed it out. I think it was Elmo, who said his source is this book. Who, if he's like, quoting Karl Popper verbatim, I don't know. That would be an interesting turn of events. But, or if he's just summarizing Karl Popper, he's done scant research that he should have been doing. And it's just so painful to have listened to that. Have him misinterpret Hegel, have him go on this screed of trying to, say there shouldn't be a theory of history, but there should be the everyman theory because individual interactions, and that's basically what the everyman theory is. And we should apply cultural context, but we shouldn't when it comes to these people because society actually does progress away from the bad authoritarian people and towards my idea of liberal progress and stuff, even though it's not exactly Voltaire's and things. It's so mishmashed and so dumb and so convoluted. I'm glad I got worked up in the process of this because it's worth it. I don't deny it was worth it. And I don't know who will see this, if anyone, but if someone shows this to Kraut, I'd love to see a response. I'd love to, I'll list my sources again. I have Hegel, a very short introduction by Peter Singer, Critical Theory Selected Essays by Max Horkheimer, the first 2 essays, Walter Kaufmann, Hegel Texts and Reinterpretation. I'm trying to think of something else I might have said, but forgot. I don't know. Maybe I forgot a few when I was reading the article, but I could go back and find out. Those are the 3 biggies, though. Or if you want to learn about Hegel, the 2 biggies are Hegel, a very short introduction, which I cannot recommend enough. Peter Singer is a Marxist, but I think he gives a very honest, middle-of-the-road interpretation of Hegel and tries not to paint him as a conservative or like that he would necessarily bring about Marxism. And of course, Walter Kaufmann is just a great historian of philosophy and a great compiler of this type of information. If you do any looking into continental philosophy, especially Nietzsche, you run into him, but you'd run into him a lot, again, if you just study continental philosophy in general. And again, Critical Theory Selected Essays by Max Horkheimer. Great insight into the modern left here. So, okay, now, I saw there were more comments since I left off. Let's see. And then, if the state is anterior to the individual, how can they own it? The state grants possession, which is codified in law. Well, because the state isn't fully anterior to the individual is the answer to that question, put simply. The state resides within us and we reside within the state because, the state is the mob trying not to be the mob is how I would put it, essentially. Not a lot of people want to talk about it, but that's sort of how it goes. No, I don't like this. Hold on. Okay, I like this better. Let's see. Damn it, I lost my place. The state grants possession, which is then codified in law. Yeah, but we grant the state ability to make that justification in the first place. I'm not advocating social contract theory or anything like that. I'm just saying, it's an indeterminable tension is how Zizek would put it. The postmodernists might put it. I'm just taking terminology at this point, but that's the best I got at the moment. By that logic, Kraut should be an anti-Zionist. I wish I didn't see that, or I wish I saw that at the time. I'm sorry, I don't know the context. Oive, there's a distinction between the sovereign and his subjects. The latter cannot own the former. Well, yeah, they can. They can rise up and execute him, and that would be owning him pretty hard in the colloquial sense. But no, in all honesty, authority is divine, and you can't challenge it, obviously. But abuse of authority doesn't go unnoticed. And if you're no longer in accord with natural law, then the state hasn't done its job of keeping the mob, the lid on the mob. The mob will rise up and overthrow the sovereign, and that's justified. But the mob shouldn't fool itself into believing it's the one who should take power, which is what democracy is. The mob has to simply reestablish a monarch who can actually be in accord with natural law. It's why I don't argue against separation of church and state, because separation is dumb. We should have these people as modern. We should have these people as moral leaders today. His citation is Karl Popper. That's why I sent you that link. Oh, okay. I'll check it out. Because again, don't trust liberals when it comes to interpreting Hegel, because they're either trying to co-opt Hegel or they're trying to disqualify Hegel from having legitimate views because he's a meanie authoritarian who wanted constitutional monarchy and was just just believed in the Prussian state, yada yada. So Hegel needed Sorel for war and violence to be coherent. I suppose so. I mean, Sorel is one of those characters we've talked about Rodin, so I don't know. I don't know. He could be. Maybe these people are reading Sorel into Hegel. I don't know. I don't know what Karl Popper is doing, but Karl Popper's an idiot, and I don't mind his dismissing his idiocy. Expressions of will to act will always need to manifest through pure force. Yes, correct. Sorel pointed out how the war myth is an animating narrative that congeals society into a stronger syndicate. Yeah, sure, another form of national mythos that contains truth, by all means. Thus, a national syndicalist revolution could unify all the other free-floating associations in the nation into a single coordinated structure. Sure. Damn, I missed a lot. Yes, you did, Volt. I'm sorry, you did. There is Prussia today. Oh. Dominates trade sector and coordinates the EU epic style. Well, yeah, I don't know if I'm comfortable with conflating the modern German state with the Prussians, because the Prussians were really from Pomerania and sort of the Polish corridor, and they're Poles now essentially. Like, it's funny, the dude who's the head of the EU, Juncker, he's one of the last remaining Prussians, because the Prussian ruling class were the Junkers. And you know what? I guess by that logic, you can say that they are indeed dominating the trade sector and coordinating the EU epic style. So yes, the Prussians are indeed still ruling Europe, if through liberal technocratic means. So congratulations, Kraut, you played yourself. Quick question on a scale of 1 to 10, how accurate is the Rothbard accurate? Soft 3 to hard 2, to put it lightly. Go back to the beginning and listen, Volt. I think you'll actually find it useful. And I find it interesting. Greg Johnson does name drop Hegel, but operating off of the white soul narrative. Fucking Greg Johnson he's the faggot, isn't he? He's the gay one who talks about ethno-states and outlawing degeneracy, but is uncomfortable with the fact that he himself would be hung for degeneracy. Well, I shouldn't say that. People who keep their same-sex attraction under wraps without endorsing a homosexual lifestyle could live peaceful lives in his version of the ethno-state, but I think his version of the ethno-state is probably stupid anyway. What else? Plus, atrocity propaganda relies on decontextualization, faulty evidence, and unreliable testimony. True. Yeah. Absolutely true. And of course, that's what Kraut's trying to do. Once he brings up Hegel and historicization and historicism, it's like, historicism becoming atrocity propaganda is essentially the thing Kraut was trying to get a point, while, souping up his own version of historicism in a different way. It's dumb. National mythos only differs in how it is applied. In China's place, it is more rigorous since it's an overpopulated hellhole. Fair enough. No, they can't. No, the sovereign cannot be executed because at that moment he's no longer the sovereign, and it's almost tautology. Yeah, well, you're saying it's a tautology. The sovereign is the sovereign. But once he's executed, he's not the sovereign. Well, no, he's the sovereign as he's being executed. He stops being the sovereign. He's just a bad sovereign. He stops being the sovereign once his head is disconnected from his body. there's such a thing as bad sovereigns, and you can have an absolutist way of ruling that recognizes the fact that the ethos of the people, the ethnos, needs to be maintained by the sovereign, and if he does a bad job, he's just a bad sovereign, and he's overthrown, and a new sovereign needs to take his place. Grinder Greg literally thinks homophobia was a Jewish trick. Oof. Oof. Big oof. He's openly anti-Christian. All right, if he's one of those atheist white nationalist LARPers, then he is getting executed in the future rational society. I don't care. Greg Johnson was in porn? Oh boy, I'm getting all this good dirt. That's true. Sovereignty is conserved. Someone is always in charge. There is always a sovereign. I know. I disagree. Sovereigns emerge, but at some points it's fair to say that the mob is acting collectively as the sovereign. I don't think that's unfair to say. But yeah, I'll continue to read comments for just a little bit. Oh, he's a pagan LARPer too. Great. All right, well, there goes that. But I'm still reading comments, don't worry. So yeah, that's Kraut, the dumb shit, talking out of his ass about Hegel. And Murray Rothbard, the the slightly less of a, I don't know, I think on a scale of 1 to 10, who was more inaccurate when it came to interpreting Hegel? I'd say Kraut, honestly. Like, okay, the whole Rothbard article was about interpreting Hegel and Romanticism to some extent, but he ties that all into Hegel as the precursor to Marx and how that's my bad Marxism. So I would say on a scale of 1 to 10, Hegel only gets it right, a little bit, a very little bit. He gets a 3. Kraut gets a 1 to a 0 in interpretation of Hegel. So there's that. Murray Rothbard being a slightly better historian than Kraut. That's depressing. Or it should be depressing for Kraut anyway. Well, as I said then earlier, you retain vestigial liberal ideas. No, the idea of ethnos and people having the right to be ruled by a ruler who is in accord with the natural law and overthrowing that ruler when he objects to natural law isn't a piece of liberal anthropology. It's not affirming the right to the people and property and things like that. It's not saying there's any fundamental right of the people. It's dictated by natural law. The people just have to be a part of natural law. And this also sort of ties into my idea of why I like Hegel being someone who advocates for very holistic systems. And even though I believe there can be distinct parts within a system, it's not as easy as that. But I see the link you sent me, Elmo. Thank you. And I see what you sent me in chat too, Rodin. Greg Johnson's full take. Perhaps I'll do a stream on that some other time. Andrew was cool. All right, it's homosexual apologia. So be it. It has no place. Have same-sex attractions. You can live same-sex attraction with a same-sex attraction, and live an ordered life. See Boethius on Twitter. He deals with what he calls same-sex attraction, but he does not live the degenerate homosexual lifestyle. I don't know if he did live it and then he repented. I think that's what he said in tweets, but I don't want to put anything in his mouth. But he's a good guy, and he says he deals with same-sex attraction. Rodin says it's homophobia divides whites, therefore it's bad. God, there's a lot that divides whites, and therefore you could say it's bad. But If Greg Johnson is a race idolater, then I have no need for him and I have no time for him. Whatever contributions he's making, if it's in the service of race idolatry, is gay and dumb. All right. But yeah, I'll stick around for a couple more minutes if anyone else has any questions. Who am I? Who is the one been, for those of you who haven't been reading the chat, is the one posing all these questions about, the sovereign, who is he, vestigial liberal anthropology. If you have any more questions, I'll be happy to field them because, again, there's natural law, and that's what all of this fits into. And the people play a role in natural law, and so they have certain rights accorded to them. It's not saying that, they're individuals and their sovereignty has to be respected because, screw individualism. That's not my point. My point is that, they have, it's good and wholesome for a leader to lead his people in accordance with God's law, aka natural law. And so to try to deny that is the big dumb. I'm just opening up the thing you sent me now, Elmo. Karl Popper. Oh. This is his citation, eh? Marx's Hegel's and Marx's philosophy. What a goddamn conflation. Fuck it. I'll throw this up. I'll throw this up on the screen share again because now I won't go through this. Fuck. I've been streaming 2 hours. Hold on. I'll throw it to chat. I'll throw it to democracy for the second. Do you want me to read Karl Popper's bullshit on Hegel too? Because I could. I'm willing. It's just, I don't know. It's 2 hours and some of the fire in me is gone. I don't know how much of it I have to spare for Karl Popper and real liberal posting. But yeah. It's that kind of thing. Again, not that I mind doing it, but it could be a doozy. What does chat say? Chat's being very unresponsive right now. I'm disappointed. There's supposed to be like 4 or 5 of you, I think, because I'm watching the chat too, so I don't know if it's one of me. Somebody say something. Do you want me to read Karl Popper or not? Because if not, I'll just close it down and perhaps save it for another time. And see what, maybe I'll dunk on Kraut's other source then. I'll dunk on Kraut's source directly then. Dude, it's a couple of paragraphs. Okay, so just say you want me to read them then. I don't care. I'm just asking if you guys want me to read them. Have you read Schmidt? I have not read Schmidt. Read Popper. All right. I'm reading Popper then, and I'll screen share it for y'all. Share. Okay. Here we go. We're going into Kraut's bad source. So if Kraut gets a 1 and Rothbard gets a 3 for understanding of Hegel, what is Popper going to get? I imagine it's going to be in the negatives. History was central to both Hegel's and Marx's philosophy. It's a broad enough point to be barely correct. And for Popper, their ideas exemplified historicist thinking and the political dangers that it entailed. Hegel's historicism was reflected in his view that the dialectic interaction of ideas was the motor of history. The evolution of gradual improvement of philosophical, ethical, political, and religious ideas determines the march of history. Hegel argued history, which Hegel sometimes described as the gradual unfolding of reason, comes to an end when all internal contradictions in human ideas are finally resolved. Like, here's the thing. Some liberals can try to wing that into saying, oh, well, by reason, reason is going to mean freedom, guys. And so Hegel is really a liberal. So I don't see an immediate reason for Karl Popper to get butthurt, but we continue anyway. Marx's historical materialism famously inverted Hegel's philosophy. For Marx, history was a succession of economic and political systems or modes of production, in Marx's language. As technological innovations and new ways of organizing production led to improvements in society's capacity to meet human material needs, new modes of production would emerge. In each new mode of production, the political and legal system, as well as the dominant moral and religious values and practices, would reflect the interests of those who controlled the new productive system. Horkheimer gets into that, as we read before. Marx believed that the capitalist mode of production was the penultimate stage of human history. The productive power unleashed by new technologies and factory production under capitalism was ultimately incompatible with capitalism as an economic and political system. It'd probably be better to say liberalism, but which was marked by inefficiency, instability, and injustice. Marx predicted that these flaws would inevitably lead to the revolution, followed by the establishment of a communist society. This final stage of human development would be one of material abundance and true freedom and equality for all. Okay, so, reasonable enough. He hasn't gotten anything horribly wrong with Hegel and Marx yet. I'm waiting for it, though. I'm waiting for it to hit me. According to Popper, though, they disagree on the mechanisms that directed human social evolution. Both Hegel and Marx, like Plato, were historicists because they believed that transhistorical laws governed human history. This was the key point for Popper, as well as the key error and danger. Was Plato a historicist? This is the first time I'm hearing about it. I mean, I haven't read the Republic, so I guess he could be. I'm not dismissing it, but Plato's idea of forms doesn't necessarily lead to a historical historicism. Like the idea that forms exist and we're dealing with the bad shadows down here on Earth isn't the same as the dialectic, although you can make the connection somewhat, and I see it, but historians, because they lead in transhistorical laws governed human history. So it's like, is Popper just saying he's a materialist that just doesn't agree with the material dialectic? Because that's what, most modern liberals all are. They're all materialists of a different stripe than Marx, although they'll never admit it. But anyway, I'm losing my voice a little bit. The deep methodological flaw of historicism, according to Popper, is that historicists strongly see the goal of social science as historical forecasts to predict the general course of history. No. Some of the people in the Frankfurt School might have thought that. Maybe. You can glean that from Horkheimer and what I read by Horkheimer, sure. But that wasn't the goal of social science. The goal of social science, largely, if you want to go with an honest critical theory interpretation, was to bring out these inner contradictions and to try to destroy the attempted universality by bourgeois society. So it's really not supposed to be a forecast. Marx made forecasts, but that wasn't the point of his determinism. He was just saying, this is how things are going to go based on what I believe. He didn't say we should create sciences to do this, and certainly Hegel didn't. Hegel would have made a philosophical case for it, but I imagine that's too hard for Popper to argue against because he's philosophically bankrupt. But such prediction is not possible, Popper said. He provided two arguments that he said demonstrated this impossibility. This ought to be good. The first was the succinct logical argument: human knowledge grows and changes over time, and knowledge in turn affects social events. Sure. That knowledge might be, for example, a scientific theory, a social theory, or an ethical or religious idea. We cannot predict what we will know in the future, otherwise we would already know it. Therefore, we cannot predict the future. This is circular reasoning at its finest. We don't know what we'll know, therefore we can't know it, so so induction bad. I see where Kraut got it from now. It makes much more sense. No, that's wrong. We can make guesses at what we'll know at the future. We're discovering what we'll know in the future. The future is happening right now. So we do know what we'll know in the future. We just don't know it in the naive sense Karl Popper thinks it will happen. God, what an idiot. As long as this is granted, that knowledge affects social behavior, and that knowledge changes over time, two premises that Popper considers incontestable sure, the Frankfurt School wouldn't consider would consider it incontestable either. Then the view that we can predict the future cannot be true and historicism must be rejected. No. 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 We can make reasonable guesses based on things that happened in the past, and we can take guesses at what we'll know in the future. That's not impossible. It's reasonable to suggest that we'll know more about aerodynamics and things and, the history of the universe once we go to Mars, once our Lord and Savior Elon Musk gets to Mars. But this is dumb. This is a circular argument and is dumb. This argument, it should be noted, also reflects Popper's judgment that the universe is non-deterministic. That is, he believed that prior conditions and laws of nature do not completely causally determine the future, including human ideas and action. Our universe is an open universe, he said. Fine, you don't have to be a complete determinist to buy into this, though. You can be a compatibilist here. This seems like scapegoating. All right, good. Final paragraph. Popper's second argument against the possibility of historical forecasting focused on the role of laws and social explanation. According to Popper, historicists wrongly believe that genuine social science must be a kind of theoretical history in which the aim is to uncover laws of historical development and explain and predict the course of history. Poverty of historicism. I have to get this book, apparently, because this is even just a secondary source in itself. Because I'd have to see what his citation is for that. Because that's gay and wrong from everything I've read, and I like to think I've read a good bit, at least about Hegel, less about Marx. But maybe this is true of the Marxian idea of developing social sciences depending on the Marxist. But again, I refuse to paint all Marxists with the same coat of paint. Anyway, but Popper contended that this represents the fundamental misunderstanding of scientific laws. In fact, Popper argued there's no such thing as a law of historical development. That is, there are no trans-historical laws that determine the transition from one historical period to the next. You should tell your friend Francis Fukuyama that. Although perhaps they've had debates and I don't know. But either way, two retards fighting. It'd be interesting. Failure to understand why this is so represented a deep philosophical error. There may be sociological laws that govern human behavior within particular social systems or institutions, Popper said. For instance, the laws of supply and demand are kind of social laws governing market economies. But the future course of history cannot be predicted, and in particular, laws that govern the general trajectory of history do not exist. Well, fucking, what is economics then? And I made this point to Kraut. We can predict economic futures within the capitalist framework. We do it reasonably well most of the time. Like, barring a few exceptions, pretty much everybody knew we were in the bubble. Some idiots thought it wasn't going to pop, a la Paul Krugman. Others said it would, but it would be manageable. Others said, we're going to economically die, and others are predicting the next bubble will pop right now. So, economics is a thing. Like, we can forecast the future with it. If you want to say, well, capitalist economics can't predict the future economic system, well, yeah, no duh. But we can still predict the future to a reasonable degree. Like, again, this is such a totalist mentality. This is such an all or nothing mentality. It's so painful. Popper does not deny that there can be historical trends, a tendency towards greater freedom and equality, more wealth, or better technology, for instance. Okay, so he is a Fukuyamist. Never mind. But unlike genuine laws, trends are always dependent upon conditions. Change the conditions, and the trends may alter or disappear. Okay, what changes the conditions? Are there immutable laws to those changing conditions? Do physics change those laws? Does geography? Does genetics? Is it just conditions, this undefined big ontological center that we're supposed to take as the other here? I don't buy it. Popper acknowledges that in certain cases, natural scientists can predict the future, even the distant future, with some confidence, as is the case with astronomy, for instance. Okay, good. He's not totally dumb. But this type of successful long-range forecasting can occur only in physical systems that are well-isolated, stationary, and recurrent, such as the solar system. Social systems can never be isolated and stationary, however. Okay, so this is the basis for a lot of kraut, then. This whole idea that it's tabula rasa, then. Fuck Popper. Get bent. This tabula rasa bullshit. That, social systems and conditions are ever changing. We can't be too deterministic about them. Get bent. I'm happy I read this now because I'm even more fired up. Karl Popper, for his interpretation of Hegel, gets a -2. Rothbard got a 3. Kraut gets a 1 out of 10. Karl Popper gets a -2, which is being generous. I want to tack on points for him being a stinky liberal and making it like 3 or like making it -5, but just based on his interpretation of Hegel alone, it's dumb. Let's see. What do you say? The problem with Marxism is that it doesn't go far enough. It labors under the delusion that you can separate property into categories of private and socialized, and that these distinctions are meaningful. Liberals operate off of a historically rudderless conception of materialism. Those statements that Rodin just said are all completely accurate. So, I don't disagree. Yeah, and Zizek again makes, yes, thank you, Olmo. That was very insightful. And Zizek makes this point too. If you have just this crude form of materialism, you strip away any good transcendent value to materialism in itself, and so you end up having like matter that's meaningless. A truly good materialist system, he argues, is one in which there is transcendence, but it's sort of like a physicalist transcendence, where, it's like, the epistemology behind physicalism, I think, is kind of fucked. My friend Dustbringer, or not friend, internet acquaintance Dustbringer, tried to like explain it to me, and I get it as a metaphysic, but the jump between our higher orders are down to the motion of physical things, but those motions then become transcendent is a big one. Funnily enough, Horkheimer also addresses that claim in here. If you read the 2 essays I recommended by him, which were on science in the crisis and materialism and metaphysics, you understand that neo-Marxists don't really have a metaphysic, essentially, and that they're just using metaphysics as a method. Everything is a method to them. And you see that in Zizek, who uses Kantianism as a method, who uses Hegelianism and idealism as a method, who uses Post-Modernism as a method. Did I say Post-Modernism? Maybe I did, but very good book. Or maybe not good. It's a hard read, man, and I'm lucky I have the introduction of Hegel I do, but insightful nonetheless. I'd love to hear your opinion of Horkheimer, Rodin, and the Frankfurt School in general, although you have said it's kind of based in certain ways. And I agree, there's a certain reactionary reading to a lot of this. And perhaps in 10 years, Marx will be considered a reactionary author. That is something... I don't know who said it. Maybe it was you, Rodin, but it's a worthwhile prediction to make. And it's not entirely wrong, I think. There's some reactionary element to Marx in there. But anyway, all right. So that's Kraut, that's Rothbard, that's Kraut, and that's Kraut's dumb sources. Any other questions for the night? I'll DM you of a PDF of the reactionary reading in the Discord. Yeah. Very interesting how Soros is a Popperian. Yeah, essentially. Well, you could make the case that a certain landless group of people are also rudderless materialists, but that is up for debate, perhaps. Anyway, if there's no other questions in the chat, really, I'm going to end it. This stream has essentially been going on for 2 hours and 45 minutes, roughly. So, thank you, everybody, for joining me. Thank you, everyone who did join. I hope you got something out of this. Don't go over to Kraut's video and tell him he's an idiot because he's never actually read Hegel and he's talking out of his ass utterly like a moron. I wouldn't encourage that. And don't send him this, too, because I'm not desperate for a reaction for drama because I'm an e-whore who enjoys the e-dopamine. But there's a schmuckle for you. But yeah, thanks, everybody. And peace out and have a good night. Good night.